Inflation is measured using various economic indicators that track changes in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over a specific period of time. The most common methods for measuring inflation include Consumer Price Index, CPI. The CPI measures the average change in prices paid by urban consumers for a fixed basket of goods and services. This includes food, housing, transportation, healthcare, and more. It's often used to assess changes in the cost of living for a typical household. Producer Price Index, PPI. The PPI tracks the average change in prices received by domestic producers for their output. It includes a broader range of goods and services than the CPI and provides insight into inflationary pressures at earlier stages in the supply chain. GDP Deflator. The GDP deflator is a broader measure of inflation that takes into account price changes across the entire economy. It's calculated by dividing nominal GDP, which includes current prices, by real GDP, which is adjusted for inflation. The result is an index that reflects the overall price level of all goods and services produced within an economy. Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, PCE. Similar to the CPI, the PCE is another measure of price changes faced by consumers but includes a different basket of goods and uses a different method of calculation. It's often used by the US Federal Reserve in assessing inflation trends. These indices provide valuable information about inflation rates, helping policymakers, businesses, and individuals make informed decisions. By tracking these indicators, economists can analyze price trends, assess the impact of monetary and fiscal policies, and monitor the overall health of an economy. FAQ section. What is inflation? Inflation is the general increase in prices of goods and services over time, leading to a decrease in the purchasing power of money. How is inflation measured? Inflation is typically measured using economic indicators, with the most common methods being the Consumer Price Index, CPI, the Producer Price Index, PPI, the GDP Deflator, and the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, PCE. What is the Consumer Price Index, CPI? The CPI tracks the average change in prices paid by urban consumers for a fixed basket of goods and services, representing typical consumption patterns. What does the Producer Price Index, PPI, measure? The PPI measures the average change in prices received by domestic producers for their output. It includes a broader range of goods and services than the CPI. How is the GDP deflator used to measure inflation? The GDP deflator is calculated by dividing nominal GDP, current prices, by real GDP, adjusted for inflation. It reflects the overall price level of all goods and services produced within an economy. What is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, PCE? The PCE is similar to the CPI but uses a different basket of goods and employs a different method of calculation. It's often used by the US Federal Reserve to assess inflation trends. Why is measuring inflation important? Measuring inflation helps policymakers, businesses, and individuals understand price trends, evaluate the effectiveness of economic policies, and make informed financial decisions. What is the relationship between inflation and the cost of living? Inflation directly affects the cost of living, as it reduces the purchasing power of money. When prices rise, consumers may need more money to maintain the same standard of living. How is inflation data used by governments and central banks? Governments and central banks use inflation data to set monetary policy, control inflation rates, and stabilize the economy. They aim to maintain price stability and promote sustainable economic growth. How often is inflation measured? Inflation is typically measured on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on the specific indicator and the frequency of reporting by the relevant statistical agencies.